And we're back. Hi! Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, welcome in general. My name is Eureka, and I do solved plot twisty true crime cases, and sometimes sprinkled with whatever my brain comes up with, or if I need to rant about something. So yeah, it's a fun ride. Stick along if you want to stay for the ride. So yeah, do the likey, subscribey things if you're up for that. If you've been here before, yes, you might be wondering, why don't you just wear your short hair that you fucked up, because I'm sure it looks fine now. Why do you wear those obvious wigs and hair extensions? Well, my friend, let me do a small explanation, really small. I like the short hair, but it takes so much time to make it not look like I've been electrocuted. So because I already procrastinate way too much when I'm trying to film, it's just easy to throw on a wig or clip in the extensions and just not think about it, because I really miss that about my long hair, just like being able to wake up and go about my day. Go about my day without you know, having to do anything with my hair. So I guess that's a short hair life. I will be with my short hair at some point, but it's just convenient to do it this way. Also, I like, you know, playing around with the hair. So yeah, just living living my best life. Also, still have no money to go for a hairdresser, so we'll get there at some point, Mum, I promise. Anyway, let's get into the story, but before we do, of course, we have to do a little disclaimer. This video is for storytelling and educational purposes only. Never do I mean any harm or any disrespect to the people I talk about in the videos, apart from the offenders, of course, sometimes. Also, this video may contain, or actually definitely contains, graphic descriptions of sexual assault and violence. In fact, it's gory as fuck. So, if you think that's not for you today, that's totally fine. Good on you for making that decision for yourself. I hope you have a wonderful day anyway, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Alright, let's get into the story. Woo! That's what happens when you put your laptop on the edge of the table. So today's story starts in 1985 when 28-year-old Charlie Brandt went to his best friend Jim Graves for some advice. Charlie here was actually feeling kind of lonely. Asked his friend Jim if he knew some lovely ladies for a date that Charlie could go on with. Because, you know, in 1985, children, there wasn't such a thing as Tinder. So picking up some birds wasn't as easy as just texting someone some lousy opening sentence that your mum really would not be proud of, and then having a shag about 30 minutes later. No, children, in 1985, you had to ask your mates if they knew anyone that would fit you. I mean, I know people still do that. Never mind. Now, Jim and Charlie had become friends because Jim was actually the ex-fiancé of Charlie's older sister, Angela. And even though Angela and Jim had split up, Charlie and Jim had stayed really great friends over time and actually had become even closer lately. Charlie loved to go fishing, and often Jim would go with him on his fishing trips, and they'd go out on the lake all day and just have some beers and chat away. Recently, however, Jim had actually been seeing someone again, and Charlie, who had been alone for quite a while, realised he also would kind of like to get back into the dating pool again, and he wanted something new. Now, Jim said, "Of course, mate," and he went to his girlfriend, Nancy, to ask her if she maybe knew someone for Charlie. And after thinking for a bit, Nancy tells him that she'll set him up with one of her friends called Teri Helfrich. And so she tells Jim to tell Charlie and to set up a double date with the four of them. And so only just a few days later, the four of them go on a double date at the Ocean Deck Center at Daytona Beach in Florida. Now, Teri Helfrich was very outgoing. She had a bright, big smile on her face. She had curly blonde hair, and she worked as a manager of a department store there at Daytona Beach in Florida. And Charlie was an eccentric but also warm and loving guy who had a degree in electronics and was also a radar specialist at Ford Aerospace, which I thought sounded pretty cool. And Charlie seemed to take a liking to Teri straight away, and the four of them just laughed and chatted the entire evening. Basically, it was love at first sight, and they hit it off. So Charlie and Teri, they started dating for a bit, and after only a few months of dating, they moved in together into an apartment. They really complemented one another, and one of her friends would actually also say that if my husband loved me half as much as Charlie loves Teri, then I'd be the luckiest woman in the world. So yeah, I guess that kind of describes how madly in love with each other these two were. So unsurprisingly, they would get married pretty soon on August 28th in 1986, with Jim as the best man and Nancy as the best woman? No, maid of honor. But apart from those two, there was no other family or friends there because they wanted to keep it small, and also Charlie's mum had died in a car crash when he was 13, and so they just wanted to keep it small and, you know, maybe do a family celebration later on. Now, after living there for only a short while, Teri and Charlie would decide to move to Big Pine Key in Florida, where Teri would start to work at the Human Resources Department of the Little Palm Island Resort, whilst Charlie was running an addiction facility there at their local spot to help the people that were struggling. So they settled in pretty nicely. And over the years, Teri and Charlie would just remain so happily in love, and they often would do things that would make the other one happy, such as they would make the other person's lunch every morning because they said that lunch tasted better when it was made by the one who loved you. Cute. No, I actually think it's very cute. So Teri and Charlie were super happy in the new neighborhood. However, in 1989, this lovely neighborhood would be struck by a horrific tragedy in the form of a gruesome murder. A woman named Sherry Parisho was found in a boat, murdered, decapitated, and with her heart taken out. Now, Teri, Charlie, and obviously the entire neighborhood were very scared and worried, and were telling each other to please be careful, and were looking out for one another. Unfortunately, though, police were shooting in the dark when it came to solving this crime, because even though the crime scene had been extremely bloody, it had also been meticulously cleaned, and the killer had made it so that there was no fingerprints left anywhere or any DNA to be found. And so sadly, after a while, the case would go cold. And then 5 years later, in September 2004, Big Pine Key was again in for another big scare, because Hurricane Ivan was on its way, and its path was predicted to be headed straight towards Big Pine Key. Now, Hurricane Ivan had just hit the Caribbean, killing 68 people and leaving many wounded and houses destroyed. And so emergency services at Big Pine Key were telling everyone to evacuate and to board up their houses. Now, Teri had a niece, her sister's daughter, called Michelle, and Michelle asked them to please not take any risks and wait out the storm over at her place just to be safe. Now, Michelle Lynn Jones was a sparkly, lovely, beautiful 37-year-old young woman who was working as a big-time sales executive there in Florida at the Gulf Channel headquarters. She owned a spacious home with a pool and a jacuzzi, so personally, if a hurricane was going my way, I would stay there. I wouldn't mind. And also, she was just extremely loyal and caring. So I think that was a family trait of theirs, because Teri obviously was like that as well. And Michelle loved her aunt and uncle very, very much. And so obviously Michelle had been following the news on the hurricane very closely, being concerned about them. And when it was predicted that Hurricane Ivan would go straight for the Florida Keys, Michelle phoned up her aunt and uncle, asking them to please come and wait out the hurricane at my house. We'll have some wine, we'll make some food, it'll be fun. Now, Teri and Charlie had stayed at Michelle's house a couple of times before, once when there was another Hurricane Jorge, and another time when their house was being fixed up after the hurricane. And both times they had so much fun with the three of them. Teri and Michelle would make breakfast together every morning, and every evening they'd chat the night away and make lovely dinners. So obviously, loving their niece right back, Teri and Charlie said, yes, sure, we'll come over. We'll stay out the hurricane at yours. So Michelle is absolutely delighted that her favourite aunt and uncle are coming over. And on the 11th of September 2004, Teri and Charlie arrive at Michelle's house. And it wouldn't take long for the three of them to end up, catching up, joking around, and having fun together again. Over the next few days, Michelle would go to work every morning, And then in the evening, they would all have dinner together and have wine and play board games and chat the night away. And all of them were being really happy with this decision to stay over at Michelle's. So Michelle was absolutely delighted. And so on September 2nd, 2004, Teri and Charlie would arrive at Michelle's house. And also because it was quite close to Charlie's father's house. And so on September 11th, they went over there to have dinner with Charlie's father and his sisters. And everyone was just kind of happy that it kind of worked out that way. Now, by that time, however, Teri and Charlie were planning on leaving Michelle's house either the next day on the 12th or the day after on the 13th, because Charlie had kind of started to miss his own bed, and also the hurricane threat was kind of gone. So yeah, they had a lovely family gathering and would leave in the next couple of days after. Now on Wednesday, September 15th, so a few days later, Michelle's mum, Mary Lou, starts to get worried. Michelle and her mum had a really close bond, as kind of everyone in that entire family, and they talked to each other on the phone every single day. At that time, Mary Lou hadn't heard anything from her daughter or her sister for 2 days. And so she tries to tell herself that it's fine and that she's probably being over worried, but her gut is telling her that something is wrong. And then a colleague of Michelle calls her that she hasn't been into work. So now, fully panicking, Mary Lou calls Debbie, Michelle's best friend. There were 3 of them. Michelle had 2 best friends, Debbie and Lisa, and they all had keys to each other's houses and also talked to each other every day. And Debbie lived really close to Michelle's house. So Michelle's mum and Teri's sister calls up Debbie to ask if she can maybe go by Michelle's house and do a welfare check or to see if anyone's okay. And Debbie immediately says yes, because actually Debbie was also getting worried because she hadn't heard anything from Michelle as well. And she was also used to speaking to Michelle every day, especially now because they were planning a trip to Vegas that next week. So they were supposed to, be in contact with each other about where they were going to stay and whatnot. And she hadn't been able to reach Michelle for 2 days as well. So Debbie, she says immediately, I'll go there, I'll go check. And with Mary Lou on the phone, Debbie goes to Michelle's house. When she gets there, she sees that Teri and Charlie's SUV is still parked outside, and on the porch, a small pile of newspapers was gathering. And so she's getting really scared now, thinking maybe they have died from carbon monoxide poisoning or something. And so she rushes to the front door and grabs her key. But for some reason, she couldn't get the key to her. It wasn't specified why. Maybe she was shaking, or personally, I can't get my own front door open all the time because if the weather is foggy, it expands and then everything is stuck. But she can't get the door to open. And so she thinks, okay, I'll call Lisa, the 3rd BFF, to come over as well and be with me, and also maybe her key works. And she texts Lisa, and when she's waiting for her, she walks around the house because she knows that at the garage there's a big glass wall where she would be able to look inside the house through. And now, as she walked around the corner and was able to see through the glass inside the house, Debbie would scream out in utter terror, knowing that what she had just seen would haunt her for the rest of her life. Now, obviously, Debbie immediately calls the police, and the police rush over, and they get there right at the same time that Lisa does, the other BFF. Now, with her key, the police were able to open the front door, and 3 police officers would go inside to check on what Debbie had just seen. But then, only a minute or so after they'd gone in, all the 3 officers come running back outside, out of the house, and start throwing up. The lead investigator would later say that it was such a lovely and nice home, but all of the lovely decorations and the aromas were masked by the smell of death. Soon after, paramedics, more police cars and fire trucks would show up, and the police went around the house with yellow tape. Inside the house were the bodies of 3 different people, all placed in a different room inside of the house. And those 3 people were Teri, Charlie and Michelle. Now, as the police started to piece the events together, it looked like the evening had started innocently enough. It looked like they had some dinner. Charlie apparently cooked some fish. They also had some wine and some other drinks, and it just seemed quite innocent. Also, Teri and Charlie's bags were all packed up and ready, sitting in the front hall, ready for the trip back home to Big Pine Key. Obviously, sadly, they would never make it back. Now, from what they could establish at the crime scene and from the way that the bodies were found at the crime scene in the rooms, police were pretty sure that they probably knew who did this, but they had no clue as to why. They didn't know how to find a motive. And that was until someone very unexpected showed up to the police station and wanted to share a deep, dark secret that they had kept for many, many years. And for one of the briefings of Charlie's family, his older sister, Angela, didn't show up. A bit later, she would call them and tell them that she was in the parking lot and that she wanted to talk, but privately, with an investigator. And they say okay, and she comes in and she shares a secret that she's been holding in for years. Now, for this story, we have to go back to Fort Wayne, Indiana, on a cozy winter night inside the Brandt's family home in 1971. Charlie Brandt was 13 years old at the time, and Angela Brandt was 15. And that day, the family had just gotten a new color TV, their first one, and it was really exciting, obviously. And so all night, the family was sat on the sofa watching, ironically, a true crime show. Now, when it was time for bed, Angela went upstairs to read her book in bed, as she always did. And her mother, who was actually also 8 months pregnant, she drew a bath for herself whilst her dad was shaving in the mirror. Angela was reading inside her room when just a few minutes after 9 p.m, she hears a loud bang coming from the bathroom, followed by her mother screaming, "Charlie, don't!" And then she hears another bang. 13-year-old Charlie Brandt had walked into the bathroom with a gun, and whilst his father was shaving, he had shot him in the back. Then he walked to the bath where his 8-month pregnant mum was bathing, who yelled, "Charlie, don't!" And then he fired several rounds into her body, killing her instantly. Angela heard him storming up the stairs towards her room. He points the gun at Angela, begging him for her life, and he shot anyway. But all they heard was a click because the gun was out of bullets. Charlie threw it away and he jumped on Angela, wrestling her. And Angela would say that she could see in his eyes that he was not himself. He had this glazed over look and his eyes were almost black. She said he looked evil. And then in the middle of this wrestle, all of a sudden Charlie seemed to wake up, sort of snap out of it. And he looked Angela in the eyes and said, "What have I done?" He sort of steps off of her and he starts crying and he starts begging her, "Please don't leave me. I can't believe that I've done this." And Angela, she promises him that she won't leave him, that she'll stay with him. But the second Charlie starts wandering around the house, she bolts for the front door, out on the street, and starts running towards the first house. And she was barefoot in her nightgown. She said it was like the girl from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I haven't seen, but to give you an idea. And when she gets to the first house, she starts banging on the doors, screaming for help, but no one is answering. And so she immediately bolts off to the next house. She bounces on the door and someone luckily opens up and she's able to run inside, and they call the police. And now by that time, the neighbor of the first house, that was 16-year-old Sandy Radcliffe, opened the door because she did hear Angela. She just wasn't quick enough to open the door. And she opened the door and on her front porch was Charlie, because he had been right behind Angela screaming, "You promised me, you promised me." He was right behind Angela and now he was standing in front of the door of 16-year-old Sandy, and he said, "Sandy, I think I killed Mum and Dad." Now everyone was shocked and said that it was the weirdest thing because the whole neighborhood, they knew the Brandt family and they knew Charlie and his mother and his parents, and they would say that Charlie was widely known as a mama's boy and that he was just so sweet and kind. And he would seem like the last kid on earth to ever shoot anyone. I don't think there's a scale where you can check how highly your kid scores on likeliness of shooting someone. But they said that Charlie was the last kid on earth to do something like this, and especially not to his mum, because he loved his mum so much, and not in a like spoiled child kind of way, but in an actually like, oh, look at them kind of way. Now back at the hospital, Charlie's critically wounded father would actually survive, thank God, and in hopes of that maybe he would be able to tell them a little bit more about what happened, the police went to him as soon as they could to question him. But all he kept saying was, I don't know why he did this. I don't know as to why my son did this. The police proceeded to take 13-year-old Charlie into custody, and they really didn't know what to make of their 13-year-old killer. And they would say that he seemed in complete shock, and that his pupils were dilated, and that he had no clue at all as to why he has done this. Now, the Indiana court ordered that Charlie would undergo 3 separate psychological evaluations by 3 different psychiatrists, and all of them would come to the same conclusion, and that was that Charlie was a complete mystery to them. They were checking him on mental illnesses to see what may have caused him to do this. And they thought that's what the court wanted as well. But they couldn't find any indications of any form of serious mental illness at all. They talked to Charlie about his friends, his family, his interest, trying to sort of uncover maybe an underlying reason as to why someone may do this. But they couldn't find anything. And also the family would say that Charlie was one of the most loving and cute kids they'd ever seen. And so the psychiatrist would say that there wasn't anything to diagnose him with. The police would also say that to the average person, this seems like total idiocracy, that he killed his 8-month pregnant mum, he shot his dad in the back, and still 3 highly experienced psychiatrists would find no evidence or indication of psychosis or any disturbing thoughts. Hello, it's editing me from the future, and this next part I didn't record, so yeah, we're doing them by voiceover now, and in just a minute we'll be back to me in moving motion. So yeah, anyway, when asked why Charlie had turned violent all of a sudden, all the 3 psychiatrists had said, we just don't know. Now, 13-year-old Charlie was still way too young to be held criminally responsible for his crimes, so he was never charged with murder, and he was also never brought to trial. Instead, a grand jury investigated and issued an ominous warning, writing that such antisocial conduct could repeat itself in the future. Famous last words. Charlie was sent to a psychiatric hospital where he would stay just over a year, only until his very forgiving father would win his release. And his father, Herbert Brandt, then moved the entire family to Florida and never mentioned it ever again. They never spoke to Charlie about what took place, and his dad never said, hey, Charlie, why'd you shoot me? Why'd you kill your mum? What were you thinking? How about an apology? Just none of those things, and he just accepted him back into the home as if nothing ever happened. Even Charlie's 2 baby sisters, who were way too young to remember what actually had gone on, they were never told the truth about their mother's death until this came out when Angela came forward. So until 2004, these 2 girls lived under the impression, or women by then, lived under the impression that their mum had been killed in a car accident. And so, apart from Angela, her father, and Charlie himself, when this happened to Michelle and Teri, no one knew about this. Or did they? Now, remember back in the beginning when I said that Angela was engaged to Charlie's best friend, or they became best friends, I think, because he was engaged to Angela, with a man named Jim Graves, who was actually the one who would set Teri up with Charlie later on. Now, when Jim and Angela were still engaged, Jim came home from work one night and Angela was having a full meltdown. She was crying and she was just extremely upset. And Jim would ask her what was wrong and she said, I can't tell you. But in the end, she realized, I'm going to marry this man. You didn't, but okay. And she realized, I think I need to tell someone I can tell him. And so she told Jim, Charlie's friend, that night what Charlie had done when he was 13 years old. And Jim obviously was in complete shock. They talked about it, and he also knew Charlie only as a grown-up and as this very calm and, kind guy. Ooh, not getting naked right now. Sorry. And so he obviously had to process it, but he kind of moved past it at some point, and he was able to talk to Charlie about it at some point as well. And they kind of moved on. And now when Jim and Angela split up, like I said, Jim and Charlie became even closer friends because Jim was obviously going through a heartbreak, and so Charlie would go on all of his fishing trips and Jim often would join him. And on one of these fishing trips, Jim would tell Charlie about how his sadness had also turned into anger and that he was just so angry. And then Charlie would all of a sudden, whilst he was boning a fish, say, you know what the best revenge is though, right mate? And Jim said, nah. And Charlie said, oh well, you kill a person and then you take out their heart and eat it. But at the time, Jim just thought that this was a weird thing that his friend had said. He did realise that how weird it was, but he also kind of didn't do anything with it, and he also liked his buddy, so all was still fine and no one said anything. There was one time though that Jim did do something, and that was when Charlie told him that he was asking Teri to marry him, because obviously Jim had no idea that the woman that his girlfriend had arranged for Charlie would actually end up being the woman that he would want to marry. And he did say to Charlie, hey mate, she's lovely, but she's a close friend of my girlfriend, so you have to tell her what happened. And at first Charlie said, I'm not sure, I did think about it, but it's been so long and I don't want to bring it all up again. But Jim said, mate, you have to tell her or I will. So now, knowing all this, let's go back to 2004 to what Debbie saw in Michelle's house that made the police run out within a minute and throw up in the bushes. The first person they found was the person that Debbie had seen through the glass window, and it was Charlie Brandt hanging from a bedsheet attached to the ceiling in the garage. Then in the living room, they would find Teri slumped over the living room sofa, and she had been stabbed about 7 to 8 times and she was covered in blood. But then the police went into the master bedroom and they found Michelle. And now this is where I want to insert a little trigger warning, because what he did to Michelle was very disturbing and just not great. So if you feel that's not for you, this is the moment to maybe either click away or mute until I do this, but then you also don't know the story, so let's see if I remember to do this. But yeah, they found Michelle in the master bedroom and she was lying on her bed. The least vile thing about her murder was a single stab wound to the chest, but everything else was just straight out of a horror movie. Charlie Brandt had disemboweled Michelle and placed her organs all over her body. He had taken out her heart and placed it beside her. Her breasts had also been removed. Her left leg was detached at the hip, and also her heart was cut out and placed beside her body. And it's hard to pick something that is the most messed up about this, but kind of the most messed up about this was that he had also cut off her head and he placed it beside her body, looking right at the crime scene. In the room, they also found 2 of Michelle's kitchen knives and a bunch of cut up Victoria's Secret underwear that was laying all over across the room, just scattered there. Also, Charlie's blood-soaked clothes was scattered across the bedroom floor, but Michelle's bloody clothes were put into the bathroom sink. It looked like after he was done with Michelle, he had taken a shower and put on some clean clothes, a white polo shirt and some blue shorts, and then he had made his way to the garage. He had taken a long white bed sheet and a metal stepladder. He tied a sheet to the rafters of the garage ceiling and he hung himself from it. But the most alarming thing that the police started to realize is that the way that Charlie had committed these murders really didn't seem like the work of someone who had done this for the first time. And this made police wonder, was there more? Could Charlie have made more victims? And so the police make their way back to Teri and Charlie's house back in Big Pine Key. And they would find it to be boarded up meticulously, and I keep saying meticulously, but meticulously precise in preparation for the storm. The police would say that they had never seen such craftsmanship. Every little piece of wooden panel looked like it had been custom fit for the place that it was meant to be for. And the holes for the doorknobs were perfect circles. They go inside and at first they wouldn't really find anything significant until they go into their bedroom. And inside of the bedroom door, so the side you'd be looking at if you were laying in the bed, bad bed. On that side of the door, there was a big graphic poster of the female anatomy, and when the police looked closer, they noticed that parts of the body were exposed so you could see the skeleton, and parts of the body, only exposed the muscular system, and then other parts only the skin. And now this rang a bell because it turns out that Charlie had copy-pasted this poster kind of onto Michelle after he murdered her. He had sort of replicated that poster and exposed part of Michelle's body that were exposed on the poster as well. Some other strange things they found were medical books, journals, and a newspaper clipping with a picture of a human heart. And now, since neither Teri nor Charlie were in the medical profession, this was a bit strange, and someone in the house at least seemed to be kind of obsessed with the human anatomy. And now something else that was also creepy that they found in the house were the enormous piles of Victoria's Secret magazines, all addressed to Charlie, so he had this subscription under the sort of pretension that he would give them to his wife. But obviously, they were all intended for Charlie. And now, if you've paid attention, you've probably noticed that we've heard the name Victoria's Secret quite often. Police would discover that in secret to himself, Charlie named Michelle his Victoria's Secret. He had given her that name because, ladies and gentle people, far from actually being a nice and friendly uncle, Charlie Brandt was massively obsessed with his niece, Michelle. Dun, dun, dun. And when police investigated Charlie's computer, they would find some ghastly websites, including subjects like death fantasies, necrophilia, snuff films, and a lot of violence against women. Now, finding all of this would make police quite sure that there was no way Charlie had not murdered more people in his lifetime. 30 years had passed since Charlie killed his mother and now committing murder-suicide. So the chances of him having more blood on his hands were very, very big. And so the police do go into their files and start looking into unsolved murders from the past decades and try to match them up or align them with Charlie's timeline of life. And quickly, potential murder cases started pouring in, and the police started to focus on the specific things that he had done to Michelle to try and match them to other things that had happened. Now, if you remember, I said a while ago that when Teri and Charlie just moved into Big Pine Key, there was a woman, Teri Helfrich, who was murdered quite close to Teri and Charlie's house. Underneath a bridge, local fishermen had found something weird in the water and they decided to reel it in. At first they thought they were reeling in a mannequin, but quite quickly they started to realize that this was actually the body of a deceased woman. Now, 38-year-old Teri Helfrich was a local homeless woman who lived in a small rowing boat. She was found on her boat, placed with her feet off of the stern, and on the bottom, like inside on the bottom of the rowing boat, you could see cuts and slashes as if she was placed on there as a cutting table. A cutting table because, just as with Michelle, Teri was decapitated and had her heart cut out. Now, for years, all the police had to go on was a sketch of a man who was seen running around the highway or along the highway around the time that the murder probably had happened, because obviously they found her in the water. And now when they saw the composition sketch of this person, it really looked like Charlie. So that was number one. Another case that immediately jumped out is the case of Darlene Toller, who was a sex worker in Miami, and she was murdered in 1995. Also found decapitated and with her heart cut out. And now, apart from the manner of the murder, there were also two other bits of evidence that really linked Charlie to the murder, but I wasn't able to find those, I'm sorry. Police also realised that Charlie was really well travelled, because over the past 30 years, not only had he travelled for work or other things all over through the United States, but also he had travelled all over the world. And because of this, investigators think that we'll probably never know the full scale of Charlie's real victims. They did say that records of Charlie's year in the psychiatric hospital channel may shed some light on why this happened or if anything more happened. However, Charlie's family is still refusing to let the state release them. And Mary Lou, Teri's sister and Michelle's mum, she would say that the Brandt family had a family secret, and apparently they were, for some reason, still really trying hard to protect that secret. Also, for some odd reason, Charlie's family allegedly never went up to Michelle and Teri's family to speak to them and to say how sorry they were that this had happened to them. I mean, obviously they were victims. They all are victims. But they never sort of came to them and said, hey, I'm so sorry that my son has done this to you and your lives. Now, I don't mean like any offense to them. I'm just saying what I found on the internet. So don't come for me. Charlie's dad, Herbert, who is around 75 years old now, still lives in Florida, as does Angela, Charlie's sister, who's now around 51 years old. And in the end, Charlie fooled everyone, and the weird thing to think about is that Michelle and Teri never actually knew the real Charlie. They knew the guy that you could rely on, that was there when you needed him, who was a great friend and who was fun to be around. And they never knew the Charlie that we know now, which is just a crazy concept to think about. Some family members of Michelle and Teri went on the Dr. Phil show, together with Jim Graves actually, to talk about the subject if Jim should have told people about what he knew about Charlie so that Jim maybe could have prevented everything from happening. Because Michelle and Teri's family, they don't blame him, but they do wish he had told more people and think he is in a way slightly responsible for what happened, because they are 100% convinced that if Teri knew about Charlie's past, she would have never stayed with him. And now obviously we'll never know that. I can't judge that. And Jim Graves actually has been saying that there was a moment that Teri said something to him that made it seem like she knew. But those are only Jim Graves' words, and maybe they are true, but we'll never know that as well. And so they went on the Dr. Phil show to talk about it, and I've seen it, and to me, I don't know, sorry if you do, but I don't really like the Dr. Phil show. I used to when I was younger because it felt like, you know, adrenaline or like, oh, what's happening, suspense. But now that I'm older and I know how, you know, human feelings work, I don't know, it's kind of loud. But yeah, it's on YouTube. I've linked it down below if you want to check it out. So yeah, that is the story of Michelle Lynn Jones, Teri Helfrich, and Charlie Brandt. All jokery aside, I do want to say that my thoughts go out to Teri and Michelle's family and loved ones, and also obviously the families of Sherry Parisho and Darlene Tola, because I don't want to even begin to imagine the trauma that they have to work through after knowing what happened to their loved ones. Sorry, that was the doorbell. I'm talking about something really heartbreaking. Stop making noises. Also, I'm curious, what would you have done if you were Jim? Would you have checked in with Teri personally to see if she knew about Charlie before she married him? Or would you just, like Jim, also not have said anything? I thought about it, and for me, I think it goes to the situation, kind of, like who the person is and how involved I am, because if I just sort of know them, I wouldn't want to get involved. I don't know, but if it's my best friend, then yeah, obviously. But then again, yeah, no, yeah, I would. Yeah, no, case closed. I definitely would. Still not getting naked. Calm down. It's the hair, probably. I think we should remove the hair because it's kind of been annoying me, and I think it's also important that we should, you know, not only present ourselves in the whole shebang here on the YouTubes, because that's why I started this channel, remember? The back was actually just sort of a big mess of these little things. So, and one big one. So yeah, that's the magic of YouTube. That's the whole thing that I've come to realize. I always used to think, we're going for it, I always used to think that I would never do YouTube. Like, I didn't even think, I wish I could, but I never will. I never even considered it, because all these people look to like have lives that look so different from mine. Not even if they were like super rich or something. Also the sort of mediocre YouTubers, it just didn't look anything like I could relate to. And so I started this channel in the beginning because I wanted more realness on the YouTubes, especially about mental health, but also about, you know, looks and appearances. So beauty really is pain, isn't it? If you're wondering why isn't it longer, then the answer is because I've cut it again twice myself. And the first time, I'm sorry, I know it sounds very easy to say this because it's not like that now, but the first time is actually done really well, and people said, oh, you've finally gone to the hairdressers, nice, your hair looks really good now. And I was like, still did it myself. So I actually did prove that I was pretty good at it. But then I started listening to a podcast a few weeks back, and I saw once again a little bit that, you know, could use some cutting. And then I sort of, my head was in the podcast story, and that's my ADHD. If you recognize this, you'll know. I feel like a sort of computer that goes into sleep mode every, like, way too often, way too quickly. I'm on, and then I'm and then I'm on, and then I'm in space. So I basically listened to the podcast, and then once again, really not learning from my own mistakes. Well, I did learn from my own mistakes, but I just did it again. I have an interesting haircut again. Obviously, it has been in hair extension beaver mode all day, so it's this is not what it usually looks like. But yeah, it's not my favorite. I don't think it looks ugly. I like it. I just really prefer my older, longer hair, which is fine because at some point it'll be back. And in my day-to-day life, I do go through life like this. In the morning, oh, this is fun because there's still hairspray. Hold on. In the morning, I look a bit like this. Hold on. Wait for it. Hi. So yeah, I think this is a really good hairstyle to close this video off with. Hi. If you enjoyed this video, I would really be happy if you liked and subscribed and do all those YouTubey things. God, like you see, we didn't call it ADHDumpsterfire for, yeah, we called it like that for a reason. Give yourself a big kiss in the mirror from me, and hopefully see you next week. Bye! Bye! A bit timid. Cherry and Charlie, human resources department. Also, because it was quite close to Charlie's. Michelle's mum calls to. Come running out of the. Was sat waiting in the psychiatrical. Trying to raise suspense here. No. Would actually end it be in 2004. Fucking hell. No. It looked like after he was done with Fish Fame, pick by PP. No. Lol.